Sometimes the smartest engineering solution isn't the one that costs $1 million or requires a team of NASA scientists. Sometimes it's just really stupid. Like, stupid simple. What if I told you that one of the greatest mechanical deceptions in the history of motorsport didn't involve hitting nitrous oxide lines, electronic traction control, or specialized fuel additives? No. It involved a trip to the grocery store. It involves something you probably have sitting in a junk drawer in your kitchen right now. We are talking about paraffin wax. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the dark art of racing engine cheats. If you're someone who loves it when a mechanic outsmarts a billion-dollar rulebook with $5 worth of household supplies, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to understand why this specific trick is so legendary, you have to understand the era we are dealing with. We need to go back to 1983. This was the Wild West of NASCAR. Today, the cars are basically spec machines. They are scanned with lasers, the parts are handed out by the sanctioning body, and if a screw is turned 3 degrees to the left instead of the right, you get disqualified. But back then, oh man, back then, the rulebook was more like a suggestion box. It was a game of cat and mouse played at 200 miles an hour. And sitting right in the center of this game was the king, Richard Petty, and his brother, the mechanical genius, Maurice Petty. Now, you might be thinking, Richard Petty, the guy with 200 wins? He didn't need to cheat. And sure, the guy could drive, but by the early 80s, the competition was getting fierce. The cars were getting faster, the aerodynamics were getting slicker, and every team was fighting for horsepower scraps. The biggest limitation they faced, the absolute hard ceiling, was engine displacement. The rule was clear as day, 358 cubic inches. That was it. You could not run 359. You definitely couldn't run 370. If you showed up with an engine that measured over 358 cubic inches, they didn't just frown at you, they tossed you out. It was the one rule you supposedly couldn't break because it was the one thing they checked with absolute precision before the race. Here's the thing, the inspection process had a flaw, a massive, glaring flaw that nobody really talked about, but everybody kind of knew existed in the back of their minds. The inspection was done cold. When the NASCAR officials rolled up with their measuring equipment, usually a P&G pump that measured the volume of air displacement in the cylinder, the engine was sitting there, stone cold, quiet. The officials would check it, certify it as legal, seal the hood, and walk away. Once that sticker was on the car, you were good to go. The car was assumed legal for the rest of the weekend. Maurice Petty, being the obsessive engine builder he was, looked at this process and started thinking. He wasn't looking for a way to make a 358 cubic inch engine faster. That's what everyone else was doing. They were porting heads, changing cam profiles, messing with compression ratios. Maurice was thinking differently. He was asking a fundamental question. How can I race a big engine but inspect a small one? It sounds like a riddle, right? How can an object change its physical size between the inspection bay and the racetrack? This is where it gets really interesting. The answer wasn't metal. Metal expands when it gets heat, sure, but not enough to gain you 15 cubic inches of displacement. You need a material that exists in one state when it's cold and completely disappears when it's hot. Sound familiar? It's the same physics that makes a candle burn down, but applying that to a high-performance V8 engine is absolutely insane. Let's pause for a second and talk about the actual scale of the advantage we are discussing here. Most people don't realize how valuable a single cubic inch is in racing. In a naturally aspirated engine of that era, the general rule of thumb was that you could extract roughly 1.7 to 2 horsepower per cubic inch if you were really pushing it. So if you were stuck at 358 cubic inches, you had a theoretical maximum power output. But if you could magically jump to, say, 373 cubic inches, you weren't just gaining a little bit of grunt, you were gaining massive torque. You were talking about an extra 25 to 30 horsepower and, more importantly, a fatter torque curve that lets you pull out of the corners while the other guys are still waiting for their engines to wind up. It's like being in a fist fight where you are allowed to bring a baseball bat and the other guy has to keep his hands in his pockets. So Maurice has this idea. Wax, but not just any wax. He needs something that is hard enough to withstand the pressure of the inspection pump, but soft enough to melt instantly when the engine fires. If he uses something too hard, it might not melt fast enough and could damage the pistons. If he uses something too soft, the inspection pump might displace it and the gig is up before the car even starts. He starts experimenting with paraffin. Now, picture the scene. It's late at night in Level Cross, North Carolina. The shop is quiet. Maurice is there with a block of wax and a Bunsen burner, probably looking like a mad scientist. He realizes that if he melts the wax and pours it into the combustion chamber, specifically into the valve pockets and the area right above where the piston sits at top dead center, he can artificially reduce the volume of the cylinder. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a gallon bucket. You want to prove to someone that it's only a half-gallon bucket. So before they look inside, you fill the bottom half with concrete. They measure the remaining space and boom, it measures half a gallon. But concrete doesn't go away. Maurice needed concrete that would turn into air the moment the green flag dropped. He figured out that by coating the inside of the cylinder head and the top of the cylinder walls with this layer of wax, he could take a 373 cubic inch engine, a monster of a motor, and make it read exactly 358 on the P&G pump. The official pumps air in, the air hits the wax, the gauge reads legal, and the official walks away. But here is where the anxiety must have been paralyzing. You have to understand the risk. This wasn't a slap on the wrist offense. If you got caught with illegal fuel, they fined you. If you got caught with a roofline that was too low, they made you fix it. But tampering with engine displacement? That was the cardinal sin. That was an attack on the very foundation of the sport. If they found wax inside that engine, it wouldn't just be a fine, it would be a humiliation. It would be a stain on the Petty name that had taken decades to build. Yet, they decided to do it anyway. Why? Because winning is a drug, and in 1983, the Pettys were addicts looking for their next fix. They built the engine. They bored the cylinders out way past the legal limit. They stroked the crank. They built a 373 cubic inch beast that had no business being on a Winston Cup track. And then, painstakingly, Maurice and his most trusted crew members, guys who would take a bullet before they talked, began the process of waxing the engine. They had to heat the wax to a specific temperature so it was pliable but not liquid. They had to press it into the corners of the combustion chamber, smoothing it out so it looked like metal if someone happened to shine a flashlight down the spark plug hole. It was like sculpting. They were sculpting a lie, a beautiful horsepower generating lie. Can you imagine the tension in that shop? One sneeze, one slip of the hand, and the wax cracks or flakes off. And once the engine was assembled, they couldn't start it. That's the kicker. You can't fire up the engine to test it, because if you do, the wax melts and you lose your disguise. They had to build it, wax it, seal it, and pray that it would hold together until the NASCAR official stuck his probe in there. It was a leap of faith taken on the wings of a paraffin candle. And the day of inspection arrives. The car rolls into the tech line at Richmond. The officials are grumpy, it's loud, it's chaotic. They get to the 43 car. The official unscrews a spark plug. He inserts the tube for the P&G pump. Maurice is probably standing there, chewing on a toothpick, looking calm as a cucumber, while his heart is hammering against his ribs like a piston in a red-lined engine. The official pumps the handle. He looks at the gauge. He pumps it again, just to be sure. He pulls the tube out. He looks at Maurice. "You're good," the official grunts, scribbling a signature on the clipboard. "Next." The relief must have been physical. It was the kind of relief that makes your knees weak. They had done it. They had successfully smuggled an illegal engine right under the noses of the strictest inspectors in motorsport. But here's the thing. The hard part wasn't over. In fact, the most dangerous part of the trick was just beginning. See, passing inspection is one thing. Actually running the race without destroying the engine is another. Remember, that wax is taking up space in the combustion chamber. When the engine is cold, that space is solid. But when you fire up a 700 horsepower NASCAR V8, things get violent very, very quickly. You have explosions happening thousands of times a minute. You have heat spiking instantly. The fear wasn't just, will it melt? The fear was, will it melt evenly? If a chunk of wax broke off too early and bounced around the cylinder, it could foul a spark plug. It could get stuck in a valve seat, holding a valve open just a fraction of an inch. If that happened, the piston would come up and smack the valve, and boom, your race is over, and you have a blown engine full of illegal evidence for everyone to see. So the start of the race was a delicate dance. Richard Petty rolls off the grid. The engine is firing and the coolant temperature is rising. 160 degrees, 180 degrees. Inside those cylinders, a transformation is happening that no one in the grandstands can see. The paraffin wax, which had been masquerading as solid metal, begins to weep. It softens, turning from a solid block into a thick, viscous liquid. Now you might be thinking, where does the wax go? It's not like it can just vanish into another dimension. Well, this is where the genius of the plan really shines. It goes out the tailpipe. As the wax melts, it mixes with the burning fuel and air. It gets vaporized. For a few laps, the car might have been running a little rich, maybe puffing a tiny bit of unusual smoke, but in a pack of 40 cars all belching exhaust fumes, nobody noticed. It was the perfect disposal system. The evidence of the crime was literally being burned away by the act of committing the crime. By lap 10 or 15, the transformation was complete. The wax was gone. The combustion chambers were now clean, naked metal. And suddenly, the physics of the engine changed. The effective volume of the cylinder increased. The engine went from a choked-down 358 cubic inches to a full-throated, deep-breathing 373. It was like a switch had been flipped. Imagine being Richard Petty in that car. You're driving along, managing traffic, and then suddenly the pedal feels different. You put your foot down coming off turn 2, and the car doesn't just accelerate, it surges. It has more grunt. It has more torque. You're hitting your red limiter sooner on the straights because the engine is pulling so much harder. It must have felt like a superpower. While every other driver on the track was fighting with a standard legal engine, Petty was piloting a monster that was getting stronger with every lap. The numbers back this up. We're talking about a significant advantage here. In a sport where qualifying times are measured in thousandths of a second, a 30 horsepower advantage is absolutely astronomical. It allowed Petty to run different lines. He could drive deeper into the corner, get the car rotated, and then use that massive torque advantage to drag race everyone down the straightaway. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. And sure enough, on February 20th, 1983, at the Richmond Fairgrounds Raceway, the number 43 car was a rocket ship. Petty dominated. He didn't just win, he commanded the race. He led massive chunks of laps, and when the checkered flag waved, the king rolled into victory lane to celebrate his 198th career win. The crowd went wild. The team celebrated. Maurice Petty probably let out a breath he had been holding for 3 days. But this is where it gets really interesting. And it's a lesson in how criminals, whether they are bank robbers or race car mechanics, usually get caught. It's rarely the big crime that brings them down. It's the sloppy little mistake they make on the side. See, the engine worked perfectly. The wax trick was a complete success. If they had just packed up the car and gone home, we might never have known about it. But the team had gotten greedy. They weren't just cheating with the engine, they were pushing the envelope everywhere. A sharp-eyed NASCAR official named Dick Beatty was walking around the car in Victory Lane. Now, Victory Lane is usually a chaotic party, but Beatty was working. He was looking at the car and something caught his eye. The tires, specifically the left side tires. In NASCAR, you have left side tires and right side tires. The tracks are ovals, so the load is different on each side of the car. The right side tires take a beating, so they are harder and tougher. The left side tires are softer to provide grip. But here's the thing. The Petty team had mounted left side tires on the right side of the car. Or rather, they were using a softer compound tire where they shouldn't have been. Why? Because softer tires equal more grip. More grip equals faster corner speeds. Beatty noticed that the tire codes didn't match what should have been there. It was a visible external infraction. He frowned. He called over his team. "Check those tires," he said. And just like that, the dominoes started to fall. Because the tires were illegal, NASCAR decided they weren't just going to give the car a cursory glance. They were annoyed. They felt disrespected. So they ordered a full tear-down inspection. They told the Petty crew, "Bring the car to the tech shed. We're taking it apart." This is the nightmare scenario. This is the moment your stomach drops through the floor. Maurice Petty knew that the wax was gone. He knew the evidence had been blown out the tailpipe. But he also knew something else, something most people don't realize about engines. An engine tells a story. Even if the wax is gone, the metal remembers. When NASCAR puts an engine through a full teardown, they don't just look at it. They measure everything. They pull the cylinder heads off. They take up the pistons. They measure the bore diameter. They measure the stroke length. And then they do the math. Bore times stroke times number of cylinders equals displacement. The officials started measuring. They checked the bore. It was big, really big. They checked the stroke. It was long. They punched the numbers into their calculators. I can only imagine the silence in that tech shed. The calculator didn't say 358. It didn't say 359. It said 373. The official probably looked at the calculator, shook it, and did the math again. 373 cubic inches. It was undeniable. The engine was massive. It was a blunderbuss in a room full of sniper rifles. They turned to Maurice. "Maurice," the official said, "this engine is illegal. It's huge." Now, this is the moment where most people would fold. They would admit it. They would say, "Okay, you got me." But Maurice Petty, he played it cool. He played dumb. He looked at the engine and said, "I don't know how that happened. Maybe the carbon buildup is throwing off your measurements. Maybe the engine expanded because of the heat." He was grasping at straws, but he was doing it with a straight face. But the officials weren't buying it, and as they looked closer at the cylinder heads, they saw something odd. In the nooks and crannies of the intake ports, in the tiny crevices where the air and fuel mix, there was a residue, a faint waxy film. The wax hadn't burned off completely. There were microscopic traces left behind, like a fingerprint left at a crime scene. The officials scraped a little bit of it off. They rubbed it between their fingers. It was waxy. It was paraffin. And suddenly, the whole picture clicked into place. They realized what Maurice had done. They realized the audacity of it. They realized that they had been duped, not just today, but probably for months. The fine was historic. $35,000. In 1983, you could buy a pretty nice house for $35,000. It was the largest fine in NASCAR history at the time. They stripped the team of points, 104 championship points. It was a hammer blow. But here is where the story takes a weird turn. They didn't take away the win. Richard Petty kept the victory. Why? Well, that's a complicated question involving politics, the popularity of the king, and the weird way NASCAR rules were written back then. But the message was sent loud and clear. The wax era was over. However, the legacy of that engine didn't die in the tech shed. In fact, getting caught only made the legend grow. It forced us to ask a difficult question. Was this cheating or was this engineering? Look, if you ask a lawyer, it's cheating. It broke the written rules. But if you ask a racer, if you ask the guys who stay up until 4 a.m. welding exhaust headers and grinding camshafts, they look at the wax trick with reverence because it required imagination. It required looking at a problem, a hard displacement limit, and finding a solution that existed outside the box of traditional mechanics. So the wax trick was dead. NASCAR made sure of that. Immediately following the Richmond scandal, the rulebook changed overnight. The officials stopped relying on those polite, cold engine checks. They started implementing random post-race teardowns and, crucially, hot displacement checks. They would drag a car right off the track while the headers were still ticking from the heat and pump the cylinders. If you had wax in there, it would be liquid. It wouldn't displace volume, and you'd get caught immediately. The loophole was welded shut. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. We tend to focus on the wax part because it's funny, it's household, it's low-tech, it's clever. But the real engineering genius wasn't just in making the engine bigger. It was in making the engine run correctly as it grew. Think about it. An engine is a finely tuned air pump. Every component is selected to work in harmony with specific air volume. The carburetor jets, the ignition timing curve, the exhaust header diameter, and most importantly, the camshaft profile. All of these are chosen based on the engine's displacement. A camshaft designed for a 358 cubic inch engine is going to be different from one designed for a 373. If you just magically added 15 cubic inches to an engine without changing anything else, it wouldn't necessarily be faster. It might actually run like a dog. It would lean out because there's more air but the same amount of fuel. The power band would shift. It might detonate and blow itself to pieces. So Maurice Petty didn't just have to invent a way to hide the displacement, he had to build a transformer engine. He had to build a motor that could survive inspection as a 358, start the race as a 358, and then transition into a high-performance 373 without the driver having to stop and retune the carburetor. That is a logistical nightmare. They had to develop a hybrid tune. They likely jetted the carburetor slightly rich for the 358 setup. When the engine was cold and the wax was solid, it probably ran a little fat, maybe stumbled a bit at idle, maybe smelled like unburnt fuel. But once that wax melted and the displacement grew, the air-fuel ratio would lean out perfectly into the sweet spot. It was a time-delayed fuse. They were tuning the engine not for what it was, but for what it would become 20 laps into the race. And let's talk about the camshaft. The cam is the brain of the engine. It tells the valves when to open and close. Maurice had to grind a custom cam profile that was a compromise. It had to be mild enough to pass the visual checks and idle decently at 358 inches, but aggressive enough to take advantage of the extra airflow once the engine grew. It's like trying to tailor a suit for a guy who is going to gain 40 pounds of muscle in the middle of a dinner party. It's nearly impossible to make it look good in both stages, yet they did it. Now, you might be thinking, was it really worth all that effort? The wax, the custom cams, the stress, the $35,000 fine? Let's run the numbers. That $35,000 fine in 1983 is roughly equivalent to $110,000 or $120,000 today. That sounds like a lot of money. But in professional racing, you have to look at return on investment, just like any other business. If that wax engine trick worked for 10 races before they got caught, and many insiders believe it was running for quite a while, think about the prize money. Think about the sponsorship bonuses from STP. Think about the merchandise sales from winning races. If that engine helped Richard Petty win just 2 or 3 races he wouldn't have otherwise won, that $35,000 fine is pennies. It's a business expense. It's the cost of doing business in the winner's circle. In fact, some team owners in the garage were probably looking at the Petty fine and doing the math themselves, thinking, hey, for 30 grand, I'd buy a win right now. This brings us to a darker, more fascinating aspect of the story, the paranoia. Once the wax story broke, it didn't just affect the Petty team, it poisoned the garage. Every crew chief started looking at every other crew chief with suspicion. If the king, the squeaky clean face of NASCAR, was stuffing wax in his cylinders, what in the world was everyone else doing? Smokey Yunick, the godfather of creative cheating, famously laughed about the incident. He called it brilliant. Smokey was the guy who once put a basketball in his fuel tank to displace volume during inspection, then inflated it to push the air out and hold more gas. He respected the hustle. But for the officials, it was a wake-up call. They realized they were fighting a war against people who were smarter, better funded, and more desperate than they were. This incident ushered in the modern era of NASCAR technical inspection. Before the wax, inspection was a casual affair among friends. After the wax, it became a forensic investigation. Today, if you walk into a NASCAR garage, you see laser scanning stations. You see templates that are machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. You see seals that, if broken, result in immediate suspension. That entire infrastructure of surveillance exists in large part because of Maurice Petty. He forced the sport to grow up. He forced NASCAR to stop being a good old boys club and start being a professional sanctioning body with rigorous standards. But there is something sad about that too. When we standardized everything to stop the cheaters, we also killed the creativity. Here's what you have to understand about the mindset of a mechanic in the 80s. They didn't see the rulebook as a set of laws. They saw it as a puzzle. The rulebook says maximum displacement 358 cubic inches. It doesn't say maximum displacement 358 cubic inches at all times and at all temperatures. It didn't specify when it had to be 358. Maurice found the white space between the lines of text. Modern engineers don't get to do that. They are given a box and they have to stay inside it. If they try to think outside the box, they get penalized. But Maurice Petty took a sledgehammer to the box. And we haven't even touched on the human element of this deception. Imagine the crew members, the guys who weren't Maurice or Richard, the guys who had to physically pack the wax into the heads. They are the unsung heroes or villains of this story. They had to keep that secret. In a racing paddock, rumors spread faster than fire. Crews drink together, they travel together, they stay in the same hotels. Keeping a secret like, we are using wax to fake our engine size, requires a level of discipline that is almost military. If one guy gets drunk at a bar and brags to a buddy from the Junior Johnson team, it's over. The fact that they kept it quiet for as long as they did is almost as impressive as the engineering itself. It makes you wonder, what else did they get away with? If they were willing to try something as audacious as the wax trick, what other secrets are buried in the landfills of Level Cross, North Carolina? Were there special fuels? Were there acid-dipped chassis that were chemically thinned to save weight? We know for a fact that teams back then were using nitrous oxide hidden in the frame rails. They would pressurize the chassis tubing itself with nitrous and plumb it into the intake. When the race was over, they'd vent the remaining gas and the tank was just the car's frame. Who is to say the Pettys weren't doing that too? The wax was just the one that got caught. It was the tip of the iceberg. This leaves us to a controversial idea. Is cheating actually good for racing? Now, hear me out. I know that sounds wrong. We are taught that fair play is everything. But look at the innovation cycle. The racers cheat, the cars get faster, the officials catch them, and the safety and inspection tech gets better. The cycle repeats. It drives technology forward. Without guys like Maurice Petty pushing the boundaries, NASCAR might have stagnated. By forcing the officials to look closer, by forcing them to understand thermodynamics and metallurgy to catch the cheats, he raised the collective IQ of the entire sport. The wax cylinder trick wasn't just a scam. It was a masterclass in lateral thinking. It's the kind of problem solving they teach in engineering schools today. Here's a constraint, here's your goal, connect them. Maurice didn't use a computer, he didn't use CAD software, he used his brain and a block of paraffin. And let's be honest, there's a reason we are still talking about this 40 years later. We don't talk about the guy who followed the rules and finished fifth. We don't tell stories about the team that ran a legal 358 engine and had a nice clean race. We talk about the pirates. We talk about the outlaws. We love stories about the outlaws. There is something deeply American about the guy who refuses to be told what to do by a piece of paper. But here's the irony that makes this story a tragedy as much as a comedy. The Petty team didn't get caught because the wax failed. The wax worked. The engineering was flawless. They got caught because they got greedy. Think about Al Capone, the most notorious gangster in history. He didn't go to jail for murder or bootlegging or racketeering. He went to jail for tax evasion, a paperwork error. The Petty wax engine is the exact same story. They pulled off the heist of the century. They stole 15 cubic inches of displacement right under everyone's noses, and then they got pulled over for a broken taillight. That broken taillight was the tire swap. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would they risk a masterful engine cheat just to swap some tires? It seems stupid, right? If you have a super engine, why do you need illegal tires? Here's the thing. Racing teams are incapable of stopping. It's a sickness. If an engineer finds an advantage in the engine, he doesn't say, okay, we're good, let's relax on the chassis. No, he says, great, the engine is illegal, now how can I make the tires illegal too? It's a compounding addiction to speed. The tire scam was simple but dangerous. They took the left side tires, which are coated for the inside of the track and are chemically softer to provide more grip, and they mounted them on the right side. The right side of the car takes the brunt of the load in the corners. It supports the car's weight as it leans. If you put a softer tire there, it won't last as long, but for a short qualified run or a final sprint to the finish, it will grip like glue. It lets you carry maybe 2 or 3 miles per hour more through the center of the corner. It was a nice-to-have advantage. The wax engine was a must-have advantage. They risked the must-have for the nice-to-have. And that is the lesson here. When you are operating in the gray area, you have to be disciplined. You have to pick your battles. The Petty team tried to fight every battle at once, and they stretched their luck until it snapped. But this brings up a massive question that has been debated in bars and garages for 40 years. Did Richard Petty know? This is the elephant in the room. Richard Petty is the king. He is the smile, the sunglasses, the cowboy hat. He is the ambassador of the sport. His public stance has always been, I just drive the car. Maurice builds them, I drive them, I don't ask questions. It's the perfect defense, plausible deniability. But look, I spend way too much time looking at telemetry data, and I'm telling you, a driver knows. Imagine you drive the same Honda Civic to work every single day for 10 years. You know exactly how much you have to press the gas to merge onto the highway. Now imagine one morning you get in, and the car suddenly has 30 extra horsepower. It pushes you back in the seat. The engine note is deeper. The throttle response is sharper. Are you going to notice? Of course you are. Now take that and multiply it by the sensitivity of a professional race car driver. These guys can feel a half pound of air pressure difference in a tire. They can feel a slight wind direction change. The idea that Richard Petty, the greatest driver of his generation, got into a car that was down on power in practice and then suddenly had a rocket ship in the race and didn't think, that's weird. It's almost impossible to believe. He knew the car was fast. He might not have known specifically that it was wax. He might not have known the exact mechanism, but he knew Maurice had done something, and he drove the wheels off it. In a way that makes him complicit, but it also makes him a racer. His job is to trust his crew chief. If the crew chief says go, you go. You don't ask for a spec sheet. There is a famous quote from another racing legend, Darrell Waltrip, who once said, "If you don't cheat, you look like an idiot. If you do cheat and don't get caught, you look like a hero. If you cheat and get caught, you look like a dope. Put me where I look like a hero." That was the ethos of the 1980s. It wasn't about morality, it was about optics. The only sin was getting caught. And because the Pettys got caught so publicly, the wax engine became a symbol of getting caught. It overshadowed the brilliance of the idea itself. But let's zoom out for a second. This story isn't just about NASCAR. It's about the universal struggle between the rule makers and the rule breakers. You see this in every form of motorsport. Formula One? In the 90s, Toyota got banned from the World Rally Championship for a restrictor plate cheat that was arguably even more brilliant than the wax trick. They built a turbo restrictor that physically moved when the inspection tools were applied, sealing the engine to make it legal. But when the car was driving, the restrictor slid open, allowing more air in. The FIA president at the time, Max Mosley, actually called it the most ingenious thing I have seen in 30 years of motorsport. He banned them, but he admired them. That's the exact same energy as the wax engine. It's the engineers saying, we are smarter than the police. It's a hacker mindset. It's the same mindset that leads to breakthroughs in aerospace, in computing, and medicine. It's the refusal to accept no as an answer. However, there is a cost to this. When the wax hit the fan, it marked the end of the gentleman's agreement in NASCAR. Before this, there was a sense that the teams policed themselves. After this, the sport became a police state. The officials had to become more draconian. They started seizing parts. They started handing out lifetime bans. The fun was sucked out of the room because the trust was gone. Maurice Petty's wax trick was the party that got so wild, the cops showed up and shut down the entire neighborhood. And you have to feel for Maurice in that moment. He was a proud man. He was an engine builder who wanted to be known for making the most horsepower, not for being a magician with candles. But history has a funny way of rewriting itself. Today, nobody looks at Maurice Petty as a villain. We look at him as a folk hero. Why? Because the world has changed. We live in an era where cars are computers. If you want to make a modern car faster, you plug in a laptop and change a line of code. It's digital, it's invisible, it's boring. There is no romance in hacking software. But the wax engine? That was analog. That was physical. It involved heat and state changes and fluids and timing. It was visceral. It feels like magic because it relied on the elemental laws of physics rather than binary code. When we look back at the wax engine, we aren't celebrating the cheating. We are celebrating the ingenuity. We are celebrating the fact that a human brain looked at a cold, hard rule and found a soft, pliable loophole. We are also mourning the loss of the garage inventor. Today, you can't be a Maurice Petty. You can't just experiment in your shed and show up to Daytona and beat the factory teams. The barrier to entry is millions of dollars of simulation software. The wax trick was the last gasp of the little guy, even if the little guy was the king, using his wits to beat the system. This brings us to the final and perhaps most surprising insight. The wax trick didn't actually stop in 1983. Sure, nobody used wax again. That specific trick was burned. But the philosophy of the wax trick, the idea of mutable parts, lives on. Engineers today are still trying to do exactly what Maurice did. They are trying to make parts that change shape. We see flexible aerodynamics in Formula One, where wings bend at high speed to reduce drag, but snap back to rigid shapes for inspection. That is just the aerodynamic version of the wax engine. We see active suspension systems that try to hide their movements from sensors. It's the same game. The materials have changed. It's carbon fiber now, not paraffin. But the goal is the same. Pass inspection as one thing, race as another. Maurice Petty didn't invent cheating, but he elevated it to an art form. He made it beautiful. And that is why, 40 years later, we are still staring at that engine block, scratching our heads, and wondering, how the hell did he think of that? So, in the final analysis, was this a stupid trick? Maybe. It was incredibly risky, it was crude, it was messy. But in a world dominated by high-tech sensors and corporate oversight, there is something romantic about beating the system with a candle. It reminds us that racing isn't just about machines. It is about the people. It is about the obsessives and schemers who look at a rulebook and see a challenge rather than a limit. Maurice Petty passed away in 2020, taking his wax formula secrets to the grave. We will never know exactly what blend he used or how many races he stole. But that mystery is part of the appeal. It leaves the door open for us to wonder. It makes us look at our cars differently, wondering what secrets hide in the brackets. It forces us to ask if we have become much too reliant on computers, instead of using the raw, unfiltered creativity that built this sport in the first place. If you enjoyed this deep dive into NASCAR's most creative cheat and want more stories of mechanical ingenuity, make sure you subscribe to Legacy Motoring. We have more secrets to uncover. Drop a comment below. Was Maurice a cheater or a genius? I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you aren't bending the rules, you aren't trying hard enough. See you in the next one.